President.
Senator from Vermont.
I thank my colleague from Arkansas for yielding. Mr. President, when we talk about sequestration, when we talk about deficit reduction, it is important to put that discussion in a broader context. And the broader context has got to be, number one, what is the fairest way to move toward deficit reduction? And what is the best approach in terms of economic policy, making our country strong and creating jobs? Now, I fear very much that the debate that we are currently having really has very little to do with financial issues. I believe it has a lot to do with ideology. It is all about economic winners in America and losers in our country. It is all about the power of big money. It is all about the soul of what America is supposed to be. Mr. President, you may have noticed there was a poll done. I can't remember who did it, but it was consistent with all the other polls that I have seen. They asked the American people, are you concerned about deficit reduction? Do you think that we should cut Social Security and Medicare? And overwhelmingly, Democrats said no, Republicans said no. And yet here in the Congress, surrounded by lobbyists and campaign contributors who are very, very wealthy, that's where we're heading. We are heading toward a so-called chain CPI, which very few people outside of the Beltway understand, which will mean cuts, significant cuts in Social Security and in benefits for disabled veterans. So the American people say, we think the wealthiest people in this country should help us with deficit reduction, protect the safety net, and here in Congress, there is a fierce attack by the Republicans and some Democrats on the safety net, and to a large degree, we're allowing large corporations who are enjoying very low effective tax rates to get away with what they are doing. Now, when we talk about who should help us with deficit reduction, we've got to look at what's going on economically in the United States of America. Today, and we don't discuss this issue enough, we need more people coming down to the floor to talk about it, we have the most unequal distribution of wealth and income of any major country on earth, and the gap between the very, very wealthy and everyone else is growing wider. Today, the wealthiest 400 individuals in this country own more wealth than the bottom half of American people, 150 million people. You've got 150 million here, you got 400 over there. Well, who do you think should pick up the burden of deficit reduction? Should we go after children who are having a hard time getting the nutrition they need? Seniors who can't afford prescription drugs? Yeah, you could do that. Is that a moral thing to do? No. Is that good economics? No. Today, one family, the Walton family of Walmart, who, by the way, is probably the major welfare beneficiary in America because so many of their low-paid employees are on Medicaid, food stamps, or other federal programs, that one family owns more wealth than the bottom 40% of the American people. And you know what we did a couple of months ago? We gave the Walton family a tax break by expanding the estate tax. Today, Mr. President, the top 1% owns 38% of all financial wealth. 1% owns 38%. The bottom 60% owns less than 3% of all wealth. Well, what do we think? Do you really want to go after the bottom 60%? Families who are making $25,000, $30,000 a year, falling further and further behind, really want to take away the educational opportunities, the nutrition that their kids get? Yeah, you could do it that way. But maybe it makes more sense to go after the top 1% who are doing phenomenally well. Now, you know what? The vast majority of Americans agree with that. But this Congress does not reflect the interests of the vast majority of the American people, because it is not the American people who are funding the campaigns for members of the Senate and the House. It's not the average American who has well-paid lobbyists all over this place. Today, as Warren Buffett has pointed out, the 400 richest Americans are now worth a record-breaking $1.7 trillion, more than 5 times what they were worth 2 decades ago. And while the wealthiest people are becoming even richer, the Federal Reserve reported last year that median net worth for middle-class families dropped by nearly 40% from 2007 to 2010. Dropped by 40%. That's the equivalent of wiping out 18 years of savings for the average middle-class family. Well, who do you go after? You really think it makes any economic or moral sense to go after a middle class which is disappearing? Or maybe do you ask the wealthiest people in this country, who are doing phenomenally well, to help us with deficit reduction? Now, as bad as wealth inequality is, the distribution of income, what people make every year, is even worse. And it's an amazing statistic, and I hope everybody pays attention to this. The last study on the subject of income distribution showed that from 2009 through 2011, that's the last study that we have, 100% of all new income went to the top 1%, while the bottom 99% actually saw a loss in their income. So in a sense, it doesn't matter, given that incredible imbalance in income, what kind of economic growth you have. Because all of the gains are going to go to the top 1%. And I have some friends over in the House, our Republican friends, are saying, no, we can't ask these people to help us more with deficit reduction. And I think that is very, very wrong. So when we are talking about how to reduce the deficit, and we all want to do that, you have to understand you can't get blood out of a stone. You can't ask people who are earning less, in many cases working longer hours. You can't ask the 14% of Americans who are unemployed. If you add people who have given up looking for work and people who are working part-time, you cannot get blood out of a stone. You have got to go, as Willie Sutton reminded us, the bank robber reminded us, you go where the money is. And in this case, all of the money, all of the gains in income are with the top 1%. Mr. President, the other point that needs to be made is that we have to ask the question of how we got to where we are right now. So, number one, you have to ask, who is best able to help us with deficit reduction? It is certainly not the struggling middle class. It is surely not disabled veterans and their families. It is surely not elderly people who can't afford prescription drugs. It is surely not kids who don't have enough to eat. But the second question that you have to ask is, how did we get to where we are today? Did this deficit just come yesterday? And I think we all remember that in the last year of the Clinton administration, this country had a $236 billion surplus. And the economists were projecting that that surplus would expand, and expand. So what happened from the year 2000 to 2013 so that we went from a significant surplus to a very serious deficit? And that has to be understood when you talk about sequestration and deficit reduction. And the answer is, as everybody knows, we went to war in Iraq and Afghanistan. But a strange thing happened, Mr. President. We forgot to pay for those wars. And you know what? When you're going into 2 wars and you're taking care of all the veterans who've been hurt in those wars, that adds up to something like $3 trillion by the time we take care of the last veteran, as we must. During the Bush administration, we gave huge tax breaks to the wealthiest people in this country. Didn't offset it. That adds up. passed the Medicare Part D prescription drug program, didn't pay for that. That adds up. And most importantly, because of the greed and recklessness and illegal behavior on Wall Street, we were plunged into a major recession, high unemployment, businesses going under, less tax revenue coming in to the federal coffers. Now, I know my Republican friends say, cut, cut, cut. Cut benefits for disabled vets. Cut Social Security. Cut Medicaid. Cut nutrition. Cut Head Start. You could do it that way. But you should also understand that at 15.8% as compared to GDP, as a percentage of GDP, our revenue is almost the lowest that it has been in 60 years. So yes, in the middle of a recession, we are spending a lot of money, making sure that people don't go hungry, making sure that people who lost their job have unemployment benefits, making sure that people have affordable housing. It's true. But what is also true is that at 15.8% as a percentage of GDP, our revenue is less, almost less than it has been in 60 years. Mr. President, today, not only are we seeing a growing gap between the very, very wealthy and everybody else, it is important to take a look at large corporations. And when we do, we find that today corporate profits are at an all-time high, while corporate income tax revenue as a percentage of GDP is near a record low. Profits soaring, effective tax rate near a record low. In 2011, corporate revenue as a percentage of GDP was just 1.2%, lower than any other major country in the OECD, including Great Britain, Germany, France, Japan, Canada, etc. Corporate revenue as a percentage of GDP, 1.2% lower than any other major country in the OECD. In 2011, corporations paid just 12% of their profits in taxes, the lowest since 1972. So you got a choice. You got a choice. Do you go after the elderly? Do you go after the sick? Do you go after the children? Do you go after the poor? Or maybe do you say that when corporate profits are at a record level and their effective tax rate is the lowest since 1972, maybe you say to corporate America, hey, help us with deficit reduction. Now, the last figures that we've seen on this issue is that in 2005, 1 out of 4 major corporations paid no income tax at all, while they collected over $1 trillion in revenue over that one-year period. There are estimates, and I see Senator Levin here, whose committee—
The time has expired, and the rest has been allotted.
Let me conclude by simply saying that we're losing $100 billion a year through tax havens in the Cayman Islands and elsewhere. There are ways to do deficit reduction without hurting the most vulnerable people in this society. And with that, I would yield the floor.